I'm delighted to welcome sports and football lawyer Daniel Geey back onto the podcast. Hello, Daniel.
Afternoon.
How are you?
Doing all right, thanks. Doing all right. So still in the office, my virtual office, same as you, and just getting on, and the same as you, and just doing as best we can.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things have happened since we last spoke in February last year. Liverpool finally won the league after 30 years.
I didn't want to bring that up too early.
Messi handed in a transfer request to Barcelona. The UK somewhat stumbled eventually out of the EU. And just a small matter of a global pandemic and 3 national lockdowns. It does sort of seem like we're living in some sort of dystopian future. But how has the last 9 to 10 months been for you, I'd say, professionally?
Yeah, it came quite a lot in peaks and troughs, is the truth. Early on, I think what more or less happened, there was a lot of reactive things to be doing. So if you remember, come sort of March, April time, clubs were looking to try and either defer or reduce player salaries. So we got involved in quite a lot of that work at the elite level, which was very interesting just to be involved in. We then sort of had project restarts, although we weren't involved directly advising the Premier League, directly and indirectly mattered incredibly to a lot of my practice, really, and share a lot of Sheridans football work, because obviously if that hadn't have restarted, then there would have been quite significant financial consequences for the football industry by way of broadcasting rights, rebates. There was a decent amount of rebate from Premier League, Champions League, other contracts as well. And then we've seen issues, obviously, with France that have gone on over the last month or so as well, the Liga. So, ultimately, there were a lot of reactive questions. What about this clause? What does it mean for COVID? I don't think too many people understood or knew what a force majeure clause was back in March or April that do now. And then, I think for a lot of people, work was quite a good, for me included, probably to a degree, work was quite a good escape. It was just sort of, head down, keep concentrated, just keep cracking on, and then just keep developing into the summer, and then the autumn time, and advance of that. So, it's just like, there's a team of 10 of us now in the Sheridans sports team themselves. So, also my role is as much trying to make sure there's enough work for everyone to do as opposed to doing it myself. So it's, those type of things more generally.
Yeah. And I mean, like you've said, and plenty of people know that you work with the likes of agents, deal with contracts and stakeholders within the game. You touched on it there, like clauses that some people may not have heard of. Has COVID led to any new experiences or terms within contracts, for example, that you've never had to deal with before that have sort of reared their head?
Well, I think what it led to in a lot of ways were payment problems, is the truth. Clubs not being able to pay players, clubs, have putting the agents that they work with pretty much on the back burner, and those payment obligations. In the summer, then, when there were potential issues to do with back payments that were due, but then transfers that happened, how did that get resolved? We had the bigger picture as well, where, it would have been pretty much not unheard of, but it would be very unlikely come a year ago or even a bit longer for the EFL to put in a hard salary cap for League One and League Two, which obviously they have done as well, which is, hugely significant and is up for challenge by the sounds of it by the PFA. And whether that will happen in the Championship, and whether those more stringent restrictions will be put in place in the Premier League, who knows in that respect. But there's been quite a lot of systemic change, is the truth. The Premier League, the UEFA FFP rules were changed as a result to give clubs a bit more leeway as well in that respect. So more the issue in a lot of ways was pragmatically dealing with the issues in hand based on what the contract said, and then the disputes or otherwise that was therefore following as a result. And it was across lots of different sports. I mean, a lot of my work is obviously in football, but I do quite a lot of work in basketball as well. I'm on effectively equivalent of a FFP commission for EuroLeague basketball. So there were a lot of issues there to deal with, similar financial repercussions, but just in a different sport. And in the same way as our team worked a lot on the back to play protocols for a lot of national governing bodies, really, which was really fascinating work for them to do. So, out of a lot of difficulty, there comes a lot, as you can imagine, of legal complications and queries and difficulties to have to deal with, and that's ultimately what we've tried to do to the end of the year. And in a way, it's been a bit tricky because ultimately it's all a bit encompassing, isn't it? You just at your desk in your home, and that difference between home and family life becomes a bit work life becomes a bit skewed.
Yeah, definitely. And sticking to football, especially, as you mentioned, Project Restart, the term at the start of the pandemic, the term sporting integrity was bandied about quite a fair bit in relation to the short-term consequences to the Premier League, for example. And you're going into this 2021 season. There's been a limited pre-season, squeezing a 10-month season into what effectively 8 or 9 months, which is obviously going to have a lot of physical consequences to the players. You can ask Mr. Klopp all about that. In the long term, we're seeing now a second wave of the coronavirus itself, which is there's been sort of contained outbreaks within squads. There's examples in Manchester City, Fulham, and now most recently Aston Villa, which is quite surprising to see that FA Cup game tonight, Aston Villa against Liverpool, go ahead. Fans, of course, again, which is a real sickener, no longer allowed into the stadiums. Are there any other observations that you've made on the short-term impact on the game, and any sort of, not exactly predictions, but anything that you've considered that may impact the long term?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff isn't in a way legal, but practical and commercial and the rest. And I think one of the big considerations is player load. I definitely think so. I don't necessarily agree with Klopp on everything to a degree. But at the same time, I think his overall message is right, which I think a lot of clubs are saying the same of, which is we need to be really careful of the amount of games that players are playing and the demands that are put on those players. Now, whether that's right that we don't have 5 subs or otherwise, I almost think it becomes a little bit of a, it's not a black or white situation. Either we have 5 subs and everything's fine, or we don't and everything's a problem. But I think on that particular point, the PFA and FIFPro have definitely been giving a bit. Obviously, have been pressurizing a lot of the authorities into thinking about, and rightly so, those type of issues. Because I was reading Manchester City, if they work and play their way through all the competitions, they're playing every weekend and midweek until the end of the season from now on, which is incredibly tough to be able to do. And I don't think people are overestimating the ability of even an elite top-level squad to be able to cope with the rigors of playing so many games in such a short space of time, even without any possible more complications and postponements. I think the other flip side of the Klopp coin, to a degree, is the broadcaster imperative, and I think that has to be very much borne in mind. Nobody wins and nobody loses with what Klopp is saying, because he has a point, just as the broadcasters have their point, and the argument becomes circular and cyclical in the end. but it brings back into focus the major point, which is who's paying the bills. And the entities that are paying the bills at the moment are the broadcasters. I know Klopp wasn't happy with the early Saturday starts, but as I sort of read into the small print a little bit more and put on Twitter a little bit ago, Liverpool effectively have played 3 out of their allotted 6 potential chosen games already. Which means that they'll only get 3 more slots of a half 12 until the end of the season, which might actually help them come towards the end of the season when other teams might ultimately be playing at those particular times.
Yeah.
So, if we go back to basics, it's broadcasting rights implications, it's player load issues, it's injury issues, and as a result, its finances as otherwise. Like Liverpool are reported to potentially have been losing between 75 and 100 million pounds, and that's for a well-run team. Manchester United obviously have posted losses as well. Spurs too. Arsenal and Spurs have taken out government loans. I think Arsenal reportedly recently too. So you can see the financial implications on particularly well-run clubs and the types of issues that are impacting as a result.
Yeah, most definitely. And I 100% agree. All sorts of pokes aside with the player loading issue. Pandemic aside and all, especially you look at the elite managers within the Premier League, for prime 2 examples, Jurgen Klopp, Pep Guardiola. Ever since they came to this country, whenever it hits December time, that's always one of their flagship issues is player loading. So yeah, I 100% do agree with that, and I'm glad you brought up broadcasting issues as it's something that we have talked about before. And I want to thank you again for your contribution to my dissertation, as not only did I get a 2-1, but a lot of listeners inside the industry have said that they really enjoyed it. As I mentioned, the interview took place before the pandemic, and in summary, what I did with my dissertation is obviously this submission was during the pandemic, and I took it upon myself to sort of assess the immediate and potential impacts of the pandemic on broadcasting and ownership within the industry. For example, cash flow issues at lower league teams, which we ultimately saw. One of the primary criticisms that I received as feedback from my dissertation was to say that as there was no academic research or papers on the pandemic and its impact on the industry as of yet, that what I had to say wasn't exactly relevant. And now, not to just provoke an argument, but I think that's been justified now, as you touched on earlier on, with the rebates that have been paid to broadcasters. And one of the sort of case studies that interested me is one of the Premier League's biggest markets in China. The Premier League cancelled their agreement with one Chinese broadcaster and shortly sort of signed one with another. One of the things that you flagged, if I'm not wrong, in our first conversation was the potential issue of change in the relationship between broadcasters and the product in the future. Do you think the pandemic has done anything to impact the value proposition of English football?
Well, I think there's a few ways to look at it. I think the product suffers without crowds. I mean, it's a very simple idea and concept, but it's so unique and even strange to say that no one thought that they would be saying it, that it becomes that important. The attractiveness of the product is down in part to the fervour and support that the fans provide in stadium. And without that, at least, short term, it devalues the product to a degree. Now, the flip side of that is it provides a lot of escapism, the benefit of something that's comforting, the routine and everything else that comes with being able to watch sport, even though there's no one in stands and grounds to be able to effectively watch and complement the broadcasting service. So in a way, I think it's been shown that some of the figures for particular games, the viewing figures have significantly risen. I think in part that might be to the Sky Go uptake. So, it is becoming easier to be able to watch games. It doesn't necessarily have to be through a satellite broadcast. It can be through an OTT offering now, especially in the UK. So I think that sense of normality by having that time to be able to watch football provides a lot of comfort to people, and in effect, then the value proposition oddly increases as a result. The value that attracts to that product increases because of the wider issues going on right now. So the real question is, what does the value proposition look like when this relatively unseen, non-usual, once in a hopefully few lifetimes pandemic doesn't occur again? Everybody is back in stadia, everyone's fans are back in, and the product becomes similar to a degree as to what it was before. Because the auction tender process, I believe, will be starting this year again for the next cycle of rights. The real question is whether, because of maybe the losses or otherwise that BT, Premier League, other national broadcasters have suffered, whether their satellite broadcasters or OTT or pay TV broadcasters have suffered, whether they will have the same type of deep pockets to be able to bid for those same amounts. Query whether Sky and BT can bid the same amounts that they paid, and or whether the Premier League's, I guess, in a way, growing reliance of the overall pie of overseas broadcast revenues looks like a good ploy, in really, because you're effectively de-risking against the two biggest players, Sky and BT, causing problems by not being able to bid significant amounts. The other systemic question, very briefly, which I know we touched on as well, is there have been reports about the Premier League testing the water for particular jurisdictions for their own OTT product, i.e., going direct to consumer.
That was my next question.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Maybe you can. Yeah. So do you want to? Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, is this a nudge in the direction of a Premflix, if you will?
I think the Premier League is too savvy to suddenly think, oh, we're just going to put everything direct to consumer and hopefully we'll be fine, because you're shooting the multi-billion-pound golden goose, really, and I don't think that will necessarily happen in the short term. But I think what they will be doing in the shorter term, like UEFA is doing in particular markets, is just looking to see in particular markets how they might do a direct-to-consumer offering, partner up with particular technology, broadcast infrastructure providers, and just look at particular markets and see how they can do things, learning lessons and otherwise. They're not going to start in the next couple of tender processes, I don't think, to suddenly go, you know what, we're going to start a Premier League TV for the UK. But I think the model is slowly evolving. I also think, the Netflix, the Premflix idea, it's not really what it says either, is the truth, because Netflix doesn't do the exact thing that the Premier League is thinking about doing.
No.
Netflix has a deep library of quality on-demand content, and is obviously investing huge amounts in that sort of legacy, evergreen type of content to keep people coming back. The Premier League model is effectively transfixed on the whole on a live offering. The only similar things to a degree is effectively the way that the broadcast would be effectively enabled over the internet. So, I think there's certainly legs, and lots of other, especially American sports, are using such types of platforms for particular territories. And I'm positive it will come around in the longer term. It just query what long term looks like.
Yeah, definitely. And it's certainly interesting, and a topic of interest for myself, most definitely. Now, onto another sort of topical issue now with the UK out of the European Union. this unveils a host of new challenges for the football industry. Just to name a few, Premier League and EFL clubs can't sign non-English players until they're over the age of 18, I believe. And work permits will be allocated on a point-based system to obtain a governing body. GBA, what's the A stand for?
GBE, yeah, government body endorsement.
Endorsement, that's the one. Sorry. Now, not to go overtly political, but I voted to remain in the EU for a host of different reasons. One of them being, there's just the EU investment in the Liverpool City region over years. And just in the interest of seeing both sides of the argument, do you think the new regulations will lead to an overall improvement in British players from a grassroots level, given the increased dependence of them in future?
I think it's likely, but I think it will lead potentially to a reduction in quality. I voted to remain as well. I think, without getting too political, a lot of people were lied to when it came to Brexit. We'll start to see some of those issues arise, and we're starting to see it already with what everyone thought was going to be frictionless tariff-free trade, which isn't frictionless tariff-free trade, far from it. And somehow celebrating that the end to a free movement of people is somehow a good thing. But that's, again, a different matter too. I actually think, that being said, that the way that the work permit regime has been implemented is actually maybe vastly is a bit of an overstatement, is significantly superior to the old work permit system. Now, take away the fact that previously EU citizens could come and work in the UK. I fundamentally disagree with free movement being a bad thing. I think on the whole it's been extremely good. But what I mean in terms of the new work permit regime is that the way that players effectively get points is less to do with the national association that they play for, the national team that they play for, and much more to do with the strength of how often they play and the strength of the club in which league, ultimately the league strength they play in. So rather than it being a lot more to do with previously transfer fee and wages, it's much more to do with the strength of the team in the relevant league that will more likely get a player gain the player a GB as a result. So I actually think in a lot of ways it's a superior set of criteria that is being used. My overall issue with the system is that that's only because we were getting to a situation where free movement ends as a result. So UK players will be much more valuable because they don't have to go through the GBE system. There'll be less recruitment of European players at a younger age, as you talked about, which means more British players coming through the system. I agree with that. I go back a lot to what Rio Ferdinand, Lampard, Gerrard, lots of others said. I know we're talking at the elite level, where they were very keen on working every day with, elite, like-minded players who are of sufficient quality. Regardless, pre-Brexit, post-Brexit, those players will always get in, and there's always those outliers that you'll see of this player wouldn't have got in under this regime, this player wouldn't have gotten in over that regime, etc. I don't think it impacts the Premier League on the whole per se. Where it will impact is Championship and lower league. You just won't see that many non-UK players because it's very difficult for them to get that GBE. Because they'll have to be playing at quite a high level as a result.
Okay, and just off the cuff, what does that mean for players such as Jadon Sancho and Jude Bellingham, of course, who play for players in the EU, play for teams, in the EU?
So if you think about the inverse situation, effectively what that means is that the UK as a non-EU member state means that players wanting to play in the EU will be subject to the national immigration requirements in each country for a non-EU citizen. So they'll have to go through whatever the work permit regime was in that and is in that particular country. I think Sancho and Bellingham and others, because they came in pre, and they would be fine for the length of their current contract. But I would have thought for their next deal, I could be wrong because I don't know, German immigration law is the truth too well. They may need or are likely to require a work permit for that particular time of any extension to that particular contract. And again, like you may recall, in Spain, there are actually non-EU quotas, non-EU player quotas. So if a player was going to be signed to a Spanish team, they would need a place for a British player because they're classified as a non-EU player, which obviously makes it more restrictive based on that criteria.
Okay. No, that's really interesting. I find them, and again, I fundamentally disagree with it. I think the point is just globalization is something that sort of made the Premier League as a product so attractive, and the players that were in there. But I just, again, in terms of the topical issues in football themselves, thank you for the knowledge. Really, I always feel like I can learn a lot from someone as yourself on topical affairs. And even with the previous podcast, they've almost felt like almost sort of semi-structured interviews with sort of pre-concept ideas going in of what I wanted to find out. Although I much prefer the free-flowing podcast, a bit like a Joe Rogan experience or whatever, to just for its essence of storytelling and being able to find out more about the other person. And like you said, with the pandemic, the home becomes the office, and you spend a lot of time staying at home, if you were. And I know you are one for sources of inspiration and being of a growth mindset. So, is there anything that you've read or any content that you've been consuming over the course of the lockdowns that you've been enjoying?
Lots. I would really recommend this. I've just finished it and I'm just starting to take some notes on it. It's called Atomic Habits.
Okay.
By James Clear. It's really, really good. It's all just about how to make lots of stuff that you want to change in your life more manageable to do. Really, don't make big promises of yourself. Just make very small steps. And it's a very big oversimplification of the message, but that was really good. The other two that I recommend to everybody, let's see if I've got them here. Yeah, I do. So give me 1 second. Are these two books, which is Grit and Mindset. So Grit is Angela Duckworth, and Mindset is Carol Dweck. These are two of my favorite books. I think I've read them 2 or 3 times now, and they're really, really, really good. So I'd highly recommend them. And they've both, I think, done different TED Talks. They've done podcasts. They're just really inspirational women about dealing with stuff that you can control, stuff that you can't control, things that you're able to, find life lessons in, and how to, keep grinding.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Daniel, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the chat, and of course, anytime you've got, I know you're very busy, but if you've got a free half an hour to come on the podcast and talk about things, you're always welcome.
Look forward to the next invite, mate.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daniel.